think people don't recognize that very much at all. There's a sort of a way that in this country we kind of look at the past as disappeared. You know, it's sort of, yeah, I can't say anymore.
Right. The past is always sort of another, it's not just another country in the sense that historians talk about it, but it's something that we don't pay attention to, which is what the Trump administration in some sense was relying on in its effort to prevent refugees from Central America from applying for asylum in the United States and using the taking of children as a way to prevent that. So what does Trump say when he gets confronted about it? He says, well, Obama did it too. And what was so striking in the press response to that is they said correctly, Obama didn't do it. What they didn't also say was, and actually George W. Bush separated children from their parents in order to stop people from entering the country and applying for asylum. And that it was part of the hardening of the immigration apparatus after 9/11/2001. And so terrorizing children and their parents, separating children and marking them as unaccompanied minors, which is a category in immigration law for people who enter the country without a parent. But instead, what the Bush administration did was separate children from their parents and then say they were unaccompanied or treat them as unaccompanied. And for that matter, we talked a fair bit in 2018 and 2019 in relationship to the Trump administration about the Flores Agreement, but we failed to comment on the fact that the Flores Agreement was an agreement that began under the Reagan administration as a set of agreements about how to treat minors. And that it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, the question of can you incarcerate minors in ICE or immigration detention. And that the Obama administration also has its share to answer for in terms of the role of using expedited removal, which is, having children in particular, but all sorts of people, not allowed to have a hearing on their petition for asylum. We keep talking in this country about this as an immigration question, but it would be more accurate to say this is a refugee crisis, which is what we say when Syrians crowd the border with Turkey or with Europe and are petitioning for asylum. But when we're talking about it in relationship to the United States, we don't say, okay, these are people who are being recognized by the UN as refugees. They're in refugee shelters up and down Mexico, and they enter the United States as refugees and request asylum. And children in particular are requesting asylum. Children who are entering the U.S. as unaccompanied minors. And so in 2014, when Obama was president, we saw children entering the United States as refugees in increasing numbers, twice as many as in 2013. And the Obama administration, under pressure from the right wing, which was holding demonstrations, blaming the Obama administration for this refugee crisis, the Obama administration responded with using expedited removal. We're not going to even hear these kids' petitions for asylum. And what we know from Human Rights Watch is that a number of those children and youth were deported to their deaths in Central America. The precise violence from criminalized police and gangs that they were trying to escape ultimately claimed their lives.
You're listening to The Michael Slate Show, and we are talking today with Laura Briggs. Laura is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the author of Taking Children, A History of American Terror. And you can support this show and KPFK by requesting Laura's book, Taking Children, A History of American Terror. And remember, Any donation you make will be automatically doubled up to $1,000. You can call us at 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or go online at kpfk.org where there is a donate button at the top of the page. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about there's another point you make in your book, which is really important for people to understand. You know, you talk about what you've just been talking about, and then you also go on to the fact that Trump has unleashed a fascistic assault on these immigrants, the children, their parents, the other people that are involved in this. And he's really made it, you know, basically almost impossible for people to live. It's part of his program of driving them out, but it's also sort of, it's not just driving them out. It's like, hey, if they're dead, they won't come back and bother us. You know, and that's the kind of, I mean, the horrifying fascistic things that are going on that so many people don't even know about. And the fact that he has unleashed this whole assault, and again, I think it's very important to call it a fascistic assault on immigrants and how they live, because that's actually what's happening. And too many people in this country turn their head away from that.
Right. The United States has a lot to answer for in relationship to the rise of the right wing and of cartels in Latin America, in Central America and Mexico. And the Trump administration, John Bolton in particular, has played a role in ensuring that some of the very people that UN actors had sought to keep out of power in Central America have now moved back into positions of power and governance. And I think it's really important for folks in the United States to take a hard look at the aftermath of the wars in Central America that Reagan sponsored or Reagan backed in the 1940s, 40 years ago in the 1980s, 60 years ago. From the Contra War in Nicaragua and the role of the Contras in pushing cocaine north into the United States through Central America, the role of Plan Colombia under Clinton, the role of the Obama administration and Biden in continuing to consolidate Mexican cartels in the Northern Triangle in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and that those cartels are increasingly running government, running the police, running the military. And so when Joe Biden and Barack Obama were in power, Joe Biden took responsibility for the Obama administration's Central America policy. That's why I name him, not just because he's running for president. But I think that we need to not just look to, are we going to vote Donald Trump out of office in November? That will or won't happen. But if it does happen, I think we also need to be mindful that that while the Obama administration was much better than the Trump administration in terms of supporting those in Central America who opposed the corruption, who opposed the cartels, who sought good governance in Central America and Mexico. We also have to keep an eye on the Biden administration, because a Biden administration, should there be one, because they also played a role in supporting police and military that were deeply embedded in the cartels.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, one of the things that you talk about, too, even refusing medical care that is necessary for the survival of adults and children as well. And this is deadly. You know, you're talking about Trump, and he has really gone after the children a lot. I mean, this is something that it's hard to wrap your head around. He's actually gone after children. And actually, when children and others disappeared, it was more often than not a product of state repression, which I think a lot of people don't even consider. It's something like, when I read that, it was kind of slapped me in the head. It's like, of course, state repression. They're going after the children. That's what it is. You can't call it anything other than that. That's the reality. And I think that people need to understand the importance of understanding that.
I've learned so much from talking to activists in Central America who, since the 1970s and 80s, have been pursuing the question of the disappearance of children and the disappearance of adults as well, but really thinking through what is the role of state repression in harming families on purpose. So in taking children from families and households, strategy. And it's really taught me a lot about how to think about the United States. That when I read about the role of white citizens councils and state legislatures and governors in separating children from their families during the civil rights movement, in response to the Black Rebellion in the South and the North, all of a sudden I understood that what Central American activists were talking about in their country had also happened in our country. And so, of course, it was no surprise exactly to me when the Trump administration very explicitly began naming a strategy of taking children in order to prevent people from applying for asylum. For many people, it was a shock. The Obama administration had, in fact, talked about doing exactly that and said, no, we absolutely can't do it. And the reason that they can't do it, though, is a credit to activists in the United States. We have the long history of an abolitionist movement that focused on this question of the taking of children from enslaved mothers and families. We have a long history of calling out that kind of abuse. So during the Civil Rights Movement, the Urban League organized a campaign, an international campaign, against the cutting off of federal benefits to mothers in the South who relied on federal benefits to feed their kids. They had an international campaign called Save the Babies. And so this kind of targeted violence, on the one hand, is wrenching and intimate. It destroys the sort of insides of families. And on the other hand, we have a history in the United States of activists calling it out, not as well-developed and sophisticated perhaps as the activists in Latin America, in Central America and Mexico who have called it out, but we can and have done this consistently.
You know, and as you're talking, I keep coming back to, again, this thing you've spoken to somewhat, but it just keeps coming up because it's, you know, you've described what's being done to the children as taking them as a strategy. And I really do think it's very important for people to understand this, because even just rolling off of that, you also talk about the outrageous Nazi character of Trump. You know, in the face of this, the horror that he's argued that you have to take the children away if you want to affect your political goals. In this case, these are very bad goals. There's no way of saying, oh, well, you know, he meant well. You know, the guy's a Nazi, and what he's doing to these children is incredibly, I mean, it just goes against every just bone of I don't know what you'd call it. You know, it's you look at it and it's the most incredible fascistic thing that you can think of. What's happening to children simply because they're born in another country, they have a skin color that's darker than what the U.S. prefers, they have all of this other stuff that's happening, and that basically, in the face of all of it, Trump says that, nah, take the children away. If you want to affect your political goals, you got to do that. This is and in this case, these are very bad goals. It's important that people understand that these are very bad goals.
Well, and it's not an accident that the Trump administration, when it's looking for a signature issue in the political realm, has turned Border Patrol on Black Lives Matter protesters. And we saw yesterday the grilling of William Barr about essentially the disappearance of protesters in Portland, the whisking people into unmarked vans, which we also saw yesterday with the New York Police Department. But I think that the question of what effect does this kind of fascism against immigrants have on people in the United States, it should be very clear by now that as the Trump administration similarly deploys Border Patrol tactical units to places like Chicago and Albuquerque and St. Louis, that they are trying to generate a new kind of theater, a theater against Black Lives Matter protesters that reiterates the theater that they think worked well for them in taking children of migrants, of refugees at the border.
Yeah. And I'm going to go back to this for a minute because it's also, one of the things that you've been talking about, and I find it extremely important in terms of this, the Nazi character of Trump. And, what we're talking about here, and I think you made this point, but this is about America and what it is, not about one fascist in the White House. Because it's like, Trump's, you can say everything you want to say about him. He's one fascist in the White House. But there is an entire American regime that he couldn't do without that being a major part of it. And I thought what you said in the book about the Obama regime and the conditions facing immigrants then was extremely important, because people tend to sort of think that it was different. And there was some difference. You have an outright Nazi, but you also had, Obama did what he could to actually keep the immigrants out, and that's something that I think people should not forget. And there's a fact that adults and children were beaten horribly in the 9/11 attacks. When you go that far back, immigrant children and adults were beaten horribly as a result of the 9/11 attacks, inside the U.S. because of who they were, what nationality they were. This is the stuff that actually is sort of the cesspool that's running under and feeding a lot of, the most horrible things in this country.
Well, I think it's super important that we take a long look at the apparatus we've built since the Clinton era against immigrants. And not only, as I was just saying, does that same apparatus get turned against U.S. citizens, even if you have a narrowly self-interested view of U.S. citizens should be treated in a way that resembles what we think of as constitutional protections. But we also have to have a long conversation, and a substantive one, about the role of U.S. immigration policy in creating a right-wing apparatus. And that it was a long walk into these woods, and it was accomplished by Democrats at least as much as Republicans. I mean, if you really want to start looking at the production of deportation and harsh apparatus against immigration, you wouldn't look to Reagan so much as you would look to Clinton. That, for one thing, funneling people away from border checkpoints and walking through the desert as a strategy for getting into the United States, that's a Clinton-era policy. And the good thing that has come out of the Trump administration is that his anti-immigrant policies are so crass and so sadistic that they've generated substantial opposition in a way that we haven't seen in the last 40 or 50 years in the United States. And so, for the first time in a long time, the majority of people in the United States want more immigration. And they definitely think that we should be, as a country, more generous to asylum seekers. Those are sort of Gallup poll results. If we want to see the potential of those poll results, also Pew Trust, realized, then we need to keep moving this conversation forward about what kind of immigration policy do we want to see, not just in very conservative administrations like the Trump administration, very racist, let's be explicit. But also, what do we want to see when somebody is better at framing this in the language of freedom, or, as Obama was, the rule of law? If we say it's in the service of all good things, can we still stand up for the kind of generosity that we as people would like to see toward immigrants and asylum seekers?
The thing is, and I think this is actually where we're going to end up sort of closing up in a minute, but I think it's important what you're saying, but I also think it's really important to understand too that that there's a concerted effort to break any hope that people have. Immigrants, children, especially, I mean, you think about the children, and that's what your book has centered on, Taking Children, A History of American Terror. And it really is American terror when you're talking about these kids who have, I mean, they're little kids, they're kids, young kids, even if they're teenagers, they're walking through the world in a way just exploring things that they don't know about, or just, and have to rely on certain, on being able to go to certain people or certain things to understand this stuff. And what they're hit with in this country as they're coming in with their families, they're torn away from their families, they're left sometimes, I don't think it's uncommon for families to never see their children again. And I think that when you think about the horrors that have been unleashed on this, and this concerted effort to break any hope that people trying to get into this country, not because they just love America because it's so cool, but because they can't live where their home is, and they're hoping that they could get into a country where they might be able to squeeze out some existence and help take care of the folks at home. People have just refused to give up in the face of all the horrors that have been concentrated in this. I think it's really, really important that people understand that, and understand that when you hear about raids on the border and things like that, that you understand what's really behind it and why people are doing it. And damn it, people need to stand up and support when people are standing up like this. They need to stand up and support them and say, no, we're not going to allow this to go on.
Well, that's right. And it's the thing that keeps bringing children to the United States is precisely U.S. policies. It's not only the role of U.S. policy in forming the shape of cartels in Central America and Mexico, but also the so-called hardening of the border, beginning with Clinton, means that many, many, many families are separated by the border. So unaccompanied children who are entering the United States are by and large entering in response to the fact that their parents are already here, or they have a sibling who's already here who is responsible for caring for them. And the more that the structural adjustment policies mean that the net balance of payments from Central America from Central America to the United States, the money is here. If people want to work and survive, they come to places like the U.S. and Europe. And if they leave their children behind, hard immigration policies, hardening the border, enforcing border policies means that in order to achieve family reunification, people need to bring their whole family to the United States. And at the same time, they are fleeing horrific violence, but they're also trying to keep their families together.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I'm going to have to say this. Laura, I really appreciate your book and appreciate you talking with us now. I want to remind people that we're talking with Laura Briggs about her book, Taking Children, A History of American Terror. Don't miss this, all right? This is something that you've got to go out. Go out and get it now. Read it. Talk about it. Spread it around. Laura, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
Terrific.
All right, great.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Running with coyotes where the streets are paved gold. You're diving underwater when you hear the helicopter. Knowing it's all been written.
All right. I want to thank Kiana for actually bringing out that music, because you know exactly what I like to listen to in the midst of something like this. I'm Michael Slate, and you're listening to The Michael Slate Show, and we have a really, really important thing to be talking about today. You've been listening to something that I think is just incredibly important for people to know about, and you know what? Far too few people know about it, and they wouldn't know about it at all if they weren't listening to the few outlets that allow this, or who aim to have this out.